The panel that we have now is on U.S. grand strategy options, and as you know, the formula here is for me to introduce Mr. Nate Freier, who is with the U.S. Army War College and the Peacekeeping and Stabilization Operations Institute. He will be the panel moderator, the keeper and coordinator of all things good and strategic. Nate, it's all yours.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Robin. Okay. As you can probably see from the program, this panel focuses on the salient options for a new U.S. grand strategy that's inevitably going to be limited by both resource and political constraints as we go forward over the next decade. I just want to say a couple things. I mean, after 10 years of conflict in the greater Middle East at what we all know is enormous cost in blood and treasure, decision makers of all persuasions, regardless of political affiliation, et cetera, are going to be looking for strategic alternatives that are clearly less costly than those that have been pursued over the last 11 years. I would point out to you that that process, I think, is clearly taking shape with the new defense guidance that was promulgated in January, and that it clearly adheres to, with what I call two, not one, but two pivots, east towards a rising China and Asia, and in the Middle East, north towards Iran. It adheres to sort of a form of classical realism that focuses mostly on powerful and or troublesome states and not necessarily spending a great deal of time focusing on what has been kind of the non-state challenge that has plagued us over the last decade. As we know, grand strategy has always been elusive, especially since the end of the Cold War, and rationalizing national level ends, ways, means, informed in a meaningful way by risk, opportunity, and cost is particularly, I think, difficult in the current political environment that we find ourselves in. So this panel is going to take that challenge on, and I'm joined by three able partners in this. We've been charged with providing insights on a general outline of how the United States might secure its core interests under a new set of inevitable limitations. I'm joined by these three distinguished panelists. Their biographies are, their full biographies are outlined in detail in the programs that you have when you arrived at the conference. But on my immediate right is Dr. Steve Metz. He's chairman of the Regional Strategy Department at SSI and a research professor of national security affairs. To Steve's right is my friend Dr. Christopher Preble. He's vice president for defense and foreign policy studies at the CATO Institute. And finally, to Chris's right is Dr. Bernard Finel, who is an associate professor of national security strategy at the United States National War College in Washington, D.C. I'd like you all to join me now in welcoming them to this forum, and we will start out with Dr. Steve Metz.
It's been kind of a tradition the past couple of days for speakers to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be at beautiful Carlisle Barracks. Since I've worked in this building for almost 19 years now, I got to admit, it's still fun to come to work, but the pleasure's a little muted. But I would like to say that it is a great pleasure and honor to be on a panel today with three of my very favorite strategic thinkers. And you know, as Robin Dorff was creating this panel, these are some of the guys that I urged him to try to get up here. The mission of this panel today is to talk about alternative future American grand strategy. So as I thought about this, one way to do this might be to say, well, if I were king for a day and could kind of create American grand strategy, here's what mine would be. But then I started thinking about it, and I suspected that if I did that, there actually would be quite a bit of overlap with my colleagues to my right, because we really do share a lot of the same ideas. So rather than, during my time, me just kind of saying mega dittos and passing it on, I decided to take a slightly different approach that I think will frame what we're talking about this panel and hopefully provoke some discussion on that. Specifically, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the process and the potential for what I call true innovation, deep change, even revolutionary change in American grand strategy. Now, I do need to warn you that my comments today are drawn from something I've been working on for more than a year now that I'm still involved with. That's something that the Strategic Studies Institute is doing for the Army strategic leaders called the Future of American Strategy Project. So of course, in the 12 or 13 minutes that I've got, it's really hard to distill a year and a half's worth of thinking. So what I'm going to do is just really try to skim the surface on this and hopefully provoke some ideas. You know, I think all of us as students of American foreign policy recognize that there's a very much of a discernible evolutionary pattern or life cycle in American grand strategies. What's tended to happen during the period of time that we have been a global power is that there's a coalescence of general agreement at different periods on kind of the big issues, the assumptions, particularly things like America's world role, the function that the military plays in this world role. And we kind of move along with that for a while, making minor or maybe even medium-sized adjustments. But then eventually that sort of runs out of gas. The world changes, the United States changes for domestic political reasons or whatever. This old agreement, the old consensus sort of breaks down. We have a period of national debate and discussion when we revisit the big issues. We go back and ask ourselves again if we've got the assumptions right. If we want to continue having the same world role, then we build some sort of new consensus and move on from that point. You know, I think we certainly did that in the late 1940s. We did it to some degree in the early 1960s. We did it after Vietnam. We did it with the demise of the Soviet Union, and we did it post 9/11. I think it's true that today we are again entering one of those periods where the old consensus is crumbling and breaking down. And what that means is that once again, we're going to have a window of opportunity to, as a nation, really think about and debate and to realign the big things, the assumptions, the notion of America's world role. And I think we all have a sense, it's been discussed in the conference the past couple of days, that there's both a push and a pull to this window of opportunity. It's driven in part by our domestic economic situation. It's driven in part by the petering out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think something that hasn't been discussed a lot is it's also driven by the idea that Al-Qaeda, if not defeated, is certainly less of a threat than it was in the past. And I think it's also true that there's a window of opportunity because there's not clear distinction between the right and left on America's world role and future grand strategy now. So we're at a point, at one of these points in our history where there is at least the potential for significant innovation, for big changes, for even revolutionary shifts. But I'm convinced that this window of opportunity will largely close without us capitalizing on it. Because as I look at the constraints on big changes in American foreign policy, I really believe that the constraints are greater than the imperatives for dramatic change right now. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm following at least the thinking, if not the specific issue, that Peter Freier described in the last panel. The constraints on major change are very significant and to some degree unchanging. I think a lot of these constraints come from America's strategic culture and tradition, our intolerance as a people for ambiguity, the fact that we deal very well when there's a clear distinction between good and evil, war and peace. We don't deal so good with situations of ambiguity, our impatience as a nation, our difficulty understanding the impact of culture on politics, and our peculiar national self-image. I mean, as someone who's thought about and written about American foreign policy and grand strategy for decades, it's always struck me that in a lot of ways we are an insecure global power. We really need to be liked. And I think that this places some pretty serious constraints on our grand strategy. There also are some major constraints growing from the domestic context. The United States, I believe, more than any other democracy on earth, believes that public opinion, the mass public, should influence national security strategy as well as domestic politics. There are a lot of other democracies around the world that kind of say, okay, the public should play a role in domestic political issues, domestic policy, but will leave national security policy and strategy to the experts. The United States, I think, more than any other nation, is one that believes that our national security strategy should be, if not directly influenced by, at least shaped by the general public as well. And this creates a constraint. So the big question is whether the forces driving innovation today, whether the things pushing us toward big changes in our national security strategy can overcome the constraints. And my general sense is that at this point in time, they can't. The change I think we're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years in American grand strategy is what I call the easy options. And by this, I mean that we're going to make minor, maybe even a few medium-sized adjustments in our strategy. But for a period of time at least, our strategy of the future is going to look a lot more like our strategy of the past than anything radical and revolutionary. I mean, certainly I think we're going to fire a tighter regional shot group. And I mean, we're seeing that with the idea, the explicit statement of the Obama administration that we're going to focus on the Middle East and the Pacific and downgrade what little attention we've already been paying to places like sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas. I think we're going to reject, for at least some period of time, the notion of regime change by force. In other words, I don't think we're going to do in Iraq or Afghanistan, meaning that we're going to go in and remove a regime and build something on top of it. Certainly, we're going to try to rely more on standoff military power and coalitions. I think we're going to be driven for at least the next few years by what I would call the Libya model, the Libya option, at least until we find out, discover the limitations of that. Certainly, we're going to slow the pace of military advancement. I think we will continue to pursue transformation of a kind, but certainly not with the vigor that we did 10 or 15 years ago. And I think that we're going to see less focus on determining the outcomes of conflicts than we did in the past. So this is what I call the easy option, kind of changes at the margin, modest changes in our grand strategy. And I really suspect that's the way we're going to go. At the same time, though, I think it's important for particularly those of us in the community of foreign policy and grand strategy to talk about, to understand the advantages and disadvantages of what I would call the hard options. And the hard options are the true innovations, the big changes. And if you look at the discussions that are taking place in academia, in the think tanks, and even in the policy world, there are at least discussions of things that would truly represent revolutionary change in American grand strategy. One thing that we often hear, that we've heard, that's come up a couple of times at this discussion, in this conference so far, is what's called offshore balancing, a strategy of offshore balancing. What that would mean is that we would move to a strategy where our objective is simply preventing a hostile power, probably a hostile state, from dominating any of the world's crucial regions. Okay. Offshore balancing doesn't just mean that you use the Air Force and the Navy more than the Army, but true offshore balancing means that you change your actual role in the world. People are floating that idea around. Another hard option would be what I call loosening the coalition for partnerships. In other words, being willing to create partnerships with nasty dictators without any semblance of pressure toward reform, respect for human rights, or whatever. The flip side of that, and another hard option, would be tightening the condition for partnerships, for going to the Karzais of the world and other nations and saying, unless you are truly reflecting what the sort of operating procedures that we think you need to do, we're not going to be your partner. And something I've written on a number of times is what I call the partner problem that's permeated U.S. strategy for the last 10 years. In real simple terms, what that means is that we assume that our partners, like a Karzai, like a Maliki, shares our ultimate objectives. And we've kind of worked on that basis. Over and over again, we found out that that's not necessarily so true. We may eventually say, okay, we give up on trying to work with these partners that really have dramatically different objectives than we do. We're just going to kind of back off on that. Another hard option would be serious real retrenchment. In other words, absolutely writing off certain regions of the world. Another that's sometimes discussed is a less state-centric strategy. In other words, saying we're going to have a national security strategy that deals not just with other states and their security services, but with human security, with various sorts of organizations that are non-state ones. And a final hard option that gets some discussion is an increased focus on non-traditional security threats. I mean, we've heard a lot about what's called human security, the idea of climate change, of providing basic human needs, that all of these things are linked to security. There are people that propose that advocate that, but that would certainly recommend a complete and revolutionary change in American strategy. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are discussions of these radical changes, but that right now everything is pushing against it. So my prediction is that what we'll do in the next 5 to 10 years is travel the well-traveled road. We'll make minor adjustments, we'll take the easy option until this finally reaches total obsolescence, or until there is another strategic shock like 9/11 that really forces us to once again ask the hard questions. When we look out there, it's possible to at least conceive of what these type of strategic shocks, what sort of black swans might change everything. Another major domestic attack in the United States. I mean, we all have to say it's at least conceivable that there will be another mass terrorism attack in the United States, perhaps one even using weapons of mass destruction. That would be the sort of thing that would once again table all of these big questions and cause us to rethink the assumptions that undergird our national security strategy. A global economic collapse, a pandemic, perhaps some sort of high-impact, major revolutionary technological change. And another one that I think probably gets less discussion than it should is the potential for the emergence of a new hostile ideology. I mean, the central organizing element of American strategy for decades was communism. That faded away for the last 10 years. It's been on Islamic extremism. If you look at a lot of discussions of the future security environment, it's almost like we assume that we really have reached the end of history and there'll be no new hostile ideologies. To me, that's ahistorical, and I truly believe, or at least suspect, that sometime within the next 10 to 15 years, something that's not communism, that's not Islamic extremism, but is as hostile will emerge. That, once again, will erode the consensus that we've built and will lead us to the point of, once again, asking the big questions. Right now, though, I am convinced that what we'll do is simply kick the big questions down the road a little further and avoid grappling with them.
Great.
With that, I am finished.
You made it on time, Steve. Congratulations.
Okay.
Chris?
Thanks, Nate. Well, I can say it's great to be here because I've never been here before, and it's thanks to all of you, and thanks to Robin Dorff for the invitation to speak. I also should mention that I've been on panels with each of these gentlemen individually, but never with all three of them at the same time, and I realized this morning that I should have been a little less aggressive with my razor over the last, or whatever.
Or more aggressive.
Or more aggressive. More aggressive. Anyway, just an observation. I do not have slides. But I want to associate myself with Steve Metz. Tough act to follow. I think Steve is correct. I think that we are unlikely to make major strategic changes for all of the reasons that he cited. And I think that's unfortunate because I think strategic change is warranted and wise. The one thing that Steve didn't mention, I think is probably the leading argument, I'm going to just mention this and leave it aside, is the structural, there is no international structural requirement for the United States to retrench, as as Ken Waltz would predict, right? Why are we a unipole? Because we can be, and no one's going to bump. We're not going to bump into anybody else, at least at no time soon. But I also agree with you, Steve, that most of the reasons why we are not likely to change is because of our internal dynamics and our culture and whatnot. And my remarks today are based. I want to be very clear about this. It's not a question about whether we can continue. You're going to hear some people talk about our current course is unsustainable economically. I don't think that's true. You know, to paraphrase the economist Herb Stein, unsustainable things stop. Okay? By that logic, we've been on an unsustainable course for a long, long time. If unsustainable is spending more than we take in lots of different areas, not just in military spending. Now, what I'm really talking about is a choice, and I think Steve is right. We're not likely to make major choices. The fundamental question, the fundamental shift that we could take is around the question of whether or not the United States is going to continue to be the unipolar power, the world's government, the provider of global security. Pick your term, okay? Or the genuine alternative is that we expect other countries to defend themselves and to play a larger role in regional and global security. That, to me, is the fundamental distinction. That would represent a significant change in U.S. grand strategy. To put it even more bluntly, do we expect to have weak, dependent allies for the indefinite future, or are we trying to establish capable, empowered allies in the future? Or maybe not even allies, just capable, empowered countries in regions that we will, for other reasons, retreat from. Now, when you hear this, you're going to say, well, there's a lot of talk about burden sharing. There's been talk about burden sharing ever since at least the end of World War II. But our behavior and even our rhetoric really cuts in the opposite direction. Because as long as we hold ourselves out as the indispensable nation, the world's policeman, again, pick your term, others will continue to underprovide for their defense. It is a fact. And, by the way, this is as designed. Many of the defenders of the current order will claim that is a feature, not a bug of the current system. The fact that other countries choose not to spend more on their defense ultimately contributes to global security. It is better, the argument goes, that one country do it as opposed to many. Obviously, I disagree, or it will be, I hope, obvious soon enough, because I think that a strategic shift that encouraged other countries to do more would make sense. But at a minimum, I would hope that if we intend to, as Steve suggests, continue on the current course, make modifications just at the margins, if we remain determined to discourage other countries, especially other liberal democracies, from defending themselves, then I would just close with a plea. Be honest with the American people that this is the choice we have made and why. Tell them that the true object of U.S. foreign policy, grand strategy, is to discourage other countries from taking actions to defend themselves and their interests. Because that is the object of U.S. foreign policy and has been for a very, very long time. That is the bipartisan consensus. Now, I should say, you're all familiar with this consensus, and it's been articulated many different times, but there has been an alternative. So if you think of going back to Charles Krauthammer, Unipolar Power, or Samuel Huntington, William Crystal, Robert Kagan, Michael Mandelbaum, and most recently William Woolforth, all of these scholars make the case for unipolarity. There are modifications around the margins. And then there has always been a competing vision. Robert Jervis, Chris Lane, Harvey Sapolsky, Eugene Goltz, Darrell Press, Barry Posen. So there has been other opportunities in the past, to challenge the orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy has held. Okay? But go back to one of, I think, the most important articles that is often missed is a response to Samuel Huntington's argument in the case for hegemony, and Bob Jervis said that hegemony, primacy, isn't worth the candle. Okay? So these are ideas that have been out there for a long time. So I associate myself with the second group. And just to very quickly summarize, I think that there are 4 basic misconceptions to the primacy argument that are not actually true, basic misconceptions. 1, that alliances distribute our defense burdens rather than adding to them. 2, that security threats are imminent and severe, requiring urgent attention, and that they are proximate, requiring a global presence to mitigate them. 3rd, that primacy pays. It actually benefits us to be the dominant military power around the world because the alternative is far, far worse. And a corollary to this, which is that counterterrorism requires counterinsurgency. I may get to that towards the end, although I understand that subject has probably been beaten to death already, so I may just leave that off to the side. So let me just quickly go through this problem, what I see as a problem of free riding and why others disagree. At one level, this free riding reflects, I think, a different conception of threats. Because, again, the defenders of the status quo say that Americans are more inclined to assume global responsibilities. This is part of our culture. It's American exceptionalism. But there's also, a corollary to that, the kind of culture of weakness among our allies, this pervasive culture of weakness. And so some might even concede that it would be nice if our allies would do more. Others are, and here's the key, others are desperately afraid that they might do more. The truth of the matter is it can't be both, because the strategy does cut in one direction or the other, and you need to kind of choose. Which is it you are most fearful of? That our allies will do too little, and therefore that we will ultimately always be called upon to defend them, or that they will do too much? And I think that what we've done in the past and what we are likely to do in the future is to stick to the status quo, and we will see the burdens of our defending other countries grow as their responsibilities abate, their concept of security erode, their even perception of threats. They remain convinced that the world is a very benign place. It does not really require them to do very much. After all, why would you? The United States is there and has been and will continue to be into the future. So I want to emphasize this point because there have been times in the past few years when I thought that President Obama and some of his administration officials would move in a different direction, and then every single time I think that, for just a nanosecond, they change their, they clearly signal their embrace of the status quo and that they intend to continue along the current path. The national security strategy says there should be no doubt the United States of America will continue to underwrite global security. Okay? That's the point. So we can talk about burden sharing until we're blue in the face. I think in order to make it actually work and make it a reality, the U.S. government must be more reticent to intervene militarily when our U.S. vital interests are not directly engaged, and we should shape our military to reflect the fact that we expect to be less involved militarily over the next 2 decades than we have in the last 2 decades. And if we were to make those changes, then we could not continue to do all of the things that we've been doing, and I think it would force other countries to do more, and I think we should welcome that. But for too long, we haven't been willing to welcome that. Here's a key difference, however. When our resources seemed limitless, our ambitions were limitless as well, and we could imagine being able to shape the international system. We can become involved in disputes in far distant lands in ways that other small and weak countries simply can't fathom. The change would come if the U.S. military is smaller and therefore Washington was less able to get involved in those things. The governing presumption would change. And, by the way, because this is about austerity, I think, we could save some money, but I want to make another point on that. Because I don't make the case for changing our grand strategy because it's cheaper. Okay? I don't think that's the best argument, and it's certainly not the argument that has driven my analysis over the last decade. We can afford the current approach. Austerity is a good auditor, but the fiscal situation and the political situation does not require a different grand strategy. The question is, what are we willing to give up to trade off in order to continue along the current course? And this is not an academic question. Peter Feaver in the previous panel pointed out that in the 1960s, the polling data on, you asked the American people, do you wish to be the world's policeman? And consistently they said no in the 1960s, and they continue to say that today. No, they don't wish to be the world's policeman by usually a 3 out of 4, sometimes even a little bit higher than that. 2 things have changed. Number one, in the 1960s, when we were the world's policemen, our allies were still relatively weak, and especially relatively weak vis-a-vis the common enemy that we had in the Soviet Union. That obviously has changed. And the second thing that has changed is that our allies have grown quite wealthy and certainly have closed the gap between where they were in the 1950s and 1960s. And so where we are left with today is that a practical matter, sticking with the current approach means asking U.S. taxpayers to spend more on our military or expect less from our government in other places so that taxpayers elsewhere can spend less to defend themselves and continue to expect generous social welfare benefits that they built up in the 1950s and 1960s at our suggestion, okay, with our encouragement. That's the choice, okay? So leaving the politics aside and leaving, I hope, the economics aside, what we choose to do is just that. It's a choice. It reflects our interpretation of what is security comprised of, what are the key challenges to that. And I'll close with a quote from Barry Posen's article, The Case for Restraint, offshore balancing, whatever you wish to call it. I might have argued this at the beginning, but I think it's a good way to close. Posen made the case for rethinking our strategic goals well before the present fiscal crisis. He began by reminding readers of the importance of strategy, or more simply, what grand strategy is. The state's grand strategy is its foreign policy elite's theory about how to produce national security. Security is traditionally accomplished the preservation of a nation's physical security, the country's sovereignty, and its territorial integrity, and its power position, the last being the necessary means to the first three. States have traditionally been willing to risk the safety of their people to protect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and power position. A grand strategy enumerates and prioritizes threats and adduces political and military remedies for them. A grand strategy also explains why some threats attain a certain priority and why and how the remedies proposed could work. Our grand strategy has done none of these things, I contend, or at least not well, because the particular strategy that we have pursued for more than 2 decades, primacy, is loath to choose. Every crisis is a primary concern for the United States. No regional conflict can be handled by regional actors. Every humanitarian disaster, man-made or heaven-sent, demands U.S. intervention. We do not choose, or when we do, we don't choose well. The list of goals that flows from such a grand strategy is just that, a list, a long list, with little consideration for how they should be ranked. Most of us who believe that we can responsibly reduce military spending and rethink our military strategy without undermining U.S. security argue that point from the perspective that our strategy is flawed and therefore that our resources are misallocated. The alternative claim, that our strategy is sound but we can achieve the same ends with fewer means, is not tenable. Thank you.
Great, perfect. Bernard?
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Robin and General Martin, for inviting us to come out here. We're delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be here. It's freezing up here on this panel, so if I start stuttering a little bit, that might be part of the reason. One of the real challenges of coming late in terms of the speaking order is that people take your jokes. So, I was going to talk about this cool mic, but then General Walker talked about Madonna having a similar mic. I would use Katy Perry as a more up-to-date reference, since I'm younger, more hip than he is. And of course, I had a great joke about Israeli women, but Wolf took that one away, so I can't use that either. But be that as it may, I want to take my time here to, as much as anything else, I think challenge some of the assumptions that have been going on through much of the conference. In fact, that we've seen some of my previous speakers on this panel. I have a few recommendations, but really, this is hard stuff. And I think more important is for us to really sort of be clear about what kind of trade-offs we're positing under different kinds of models. And I don't think we've done a really good job in many cases about doing that. This slide sort of should be pretty obvious. This is what I think the common consensus is about what the challenge we're facing is, right? The thing that's sort of pushing us to think about new strategic directions, right? That we're facing declining budgets, this sort of whole austerity issue, that we're facing rising powers, China in particular, and we have these exploding personnel costs, which mean that even though we may want to do the same thing, even if our budgets were staying the same, our capacity, our ability to do that would be declining because we're being pushed from within through personnel costs, healthcare in particular. I want to make just a couple points about this. First of all, I don't think this part's controversial so far. One is that really, we're talking about challenges which stress the military element of statecraft, perhaps more so than some of the other elements of statecraft. And yes, certainly the military is an important element of any grand strategy we may sort of develop, and yet, sort of these pressures are not equally operative on all the different instruments. If you think about, sure, there's going to be budget pressures on things like AID and state and so on, but you're not going to be able to solve any sort of budget crisis by raiding their budgets. There just isn't enough money there. So we could conceive of a way that you don't have to apply austerity equally across the board of our instruments of statecraft, but not unquestionably, the military is going to take a certain amount of a hit. There's a question about where it has to affect your grand strategy, though, and I'll get back to that. I do want to make one caveat and foot stomp on something that Chris said, which is that these are really choices, though. Austerity is a choice. You hear a lot of rhetoric about sort of how the federal government's growing out of control and spending out of control and all that kind of other stuff. But you look, I mean, the reality is that there are fewer civilian federal employees now than there were in 1969. And that's not cherry picking. There's also fewer than there were in 1975, 1985, and 1995. It's a pretty clear line decline, about 20% since that time period, at a time when our population has more than doubled. So the number of federal employees, now if you count military employees as well, right, as employees, the numbers have declined even more, right? As a percentage of the population, the federal workforce taking military and civilian together is less than half what it was in the late 60s. If you look at non-healthcare spending by the federal government, that's also been declining ever since the 80s, all right? So that's almost a 30-year timeline there. So it's not that things aren't unsustainable. What's unsustainable is insisting upon continuous tax cuts. We've had 3 major tax cuts now over the past decade and a half, the 2 Bush tax cuts, 2001, 2003, and then the big Obama tax cut in 2009. And you combine that with exploding healthcare costs, which are, in fact, growing at an unsustainable rate. And there you do get a crisis, but it's a crisis that's certainly at least partly of choice. Our deficits of the last 2 years are a public policy failure. They're not structural, right? They're a consequence of bad Fed policies, Federal Reserve policies, and some bad policies in terms of our fiscal policies, but they're not structural weakness in the economy. Anyway, let's just leave that aside for now, and let's talk about some of the answers that people have had to this challenge. Because even I can argue until I'm blue in the face about that kind of stuff. It doesn't matter, right? The reality is for us, those in the national security community, we are in fact going to face declining budgets. And some of the answers that we've heard so far are retrenchment, perhaps across the board. The United States could do less, give primacy. Chris would argue this is a positive sum option. I'm not completely convinced by that, or at least I may be convinced by the notion that is probably positive sum, but there are risks associated, I think, that sure. Chris understates. Another answer we've seen has been refocusing, right? And this gets into the sort of notion of a tighter regional shot pattern that Steve suggested. We pivot to Asia, for example. But I think both those approaches, as interesting and valuable as they are, can be clarified a little more tightly by thinking about the issue of how they affect our different levels of risk and different types of risk that are associated with our choices. And let me go through that a little bit. So if you think about each option that we talk about has different kinds of levels of risk. You have geopolitical risk, and here's where I think the issue of Chris comes up. You know, there is the challenge that, you know, I think he's probably right, that if we do less, our allies will step up. Who are the allies is an interesting question that we'll get back to, okay? Because certainly the portfolio of allies, it's one thing if you think, oh, our NATO friends will come up and step up, and that's wonderful, we love our NATO allies, which we in fact do. But the reality is that any sort of realistic assessment of sort of global management in the future means that our allies aren't going to be our traditional portfolio, but have to rely upon a new portfolio, right? The Brazils, the Indonesias of the world, the Indias, in which I think there is a lot more risk associated. Things can go beautifully, things go horribly wrong. And so if you're talking about an issue of retrenchment in order to get better burden sharing, better cooperation, better partnership, you're accepting implicitly a high level of risk. Now, you may think that that's going to turn out well, and it may, in fact, on average, but there's a lot of risk associated with that. Another issue is this issue of military risk. This is one I think we rarely focus on, rarely talk about, because we're too willing to accept what I'd call personnel risk, all right? When we heard Mr. Work and General Walker yesterday, they both sort of talked about having a leaner, meaner, less capacity, more capable force, all right? Well, you know, a smaller force means that the force is going to be used, if you use it, in a more high-intensity way, right? And so the challenges we face all through Iraq and Afghanistan with you know, problems with our boots on the ground versus dwell times, back-to-back deployments, you're accepting with a smaller force that this is going to be one of the risks you're willing to take on. If you do have to use the force, it's going to be stressed very rapidly. One issue we never talk about or rarely talk about is this issue of military risk. Now, military risk refers to, you know, how likely military operations are likely to be. Cost in lives, cost in equipment, cost in time. And I think there's a real question we should pose about, is our current level of military risk appropriate? I'd say we don't consider that sufficiently. And why do I say that? Remember when yesterday we talked about Tom Davis said that our defense industry is now building Ferraris rather than Fords, right? I thought that was really evocative. I think it's an interesting question. Do we need Ferraris? Why? I mean, at this point, we are so far ahead of our likely threats, okay? And I'll get back to China as a separate issue in a moment, right? But all the other stuff, you know, the Iraqs, the Irans, and North Koreas, do we really need to have a capacity to engage in regime change at virtually no cost in a matter of weeks? I mean, is that the right level of military risk to accept? Or could we live with a scenario where if we do have to change regime in a place like Iraq, instead of taking 3 weeks to march to Baghdad with under 100 KIA in combat, maybe it's going to take 6 weeks or 3 months, and maybe you're going to suffer 1,000 killed. No one wants to hear that, but that's also an acceptable trade-off to think about, right? It's possible to think about, I would argue, having a military which has more capacity and less capability, right? That might be larger and cheaper, right? But would still be good enough to meet almost any of the contingencies that we're likely to face. As I point out, we're now paying essentially to be in a 99.99 uptime scenario, right? When you have a server and you want it to be up 99% of the time, it's an order of magnitude more to go to 99.9. It's an order of magnitude more to go to 99.99, right? Even though your gains are relatively small. 99 might be enough, okay? We might find that being at 95% uptime metaphorically in terms of our capacity, or capability rather, vis-a-vis rivals, is sufficient. There are real costs in terms of overshooting risk mitigation, right? And I'd say this is one of the major unstable things. This across-the-board qualitative superiority is killing us, right? And in fact, we're competing against ourselves, right? We're competing for a next generation of modernized equipment to be better than the last one, rather than to be better than our adversary stuff. Why? We've continued the same trajectory since the Cold War. The Soviet Union began to drop off that trajectory in the 1970s. We never stopped. We haven't stopped since, even though there's been no rival. Okay? There's another thing that's problematic, which is that the military risk we face now is so low that it encourages feckless uses of force. Right? Decision makers don't have to think hard about using force. They just do it. Right? They see it as cheap, easy. No one's going to die. There aren't going to be 10,000 body bags. There aren't going to be protests in the streets. Right? I can do it cheap and easy. And the consequence that U.S. capacity and throughput is less than predicted by expenditures. We spend 45% of the world's military expenditures, right? And yet, Iraq and Afghanistan stress us. Two countries whose entire GDPs are less than we spend on defense in a week. How is that possible, right? That's because we've overshot the risk mitigation on military risk. Now, let's say we didn't do that. Let's say we thought about playing our capabilities to be able to deal with more likely scenarios like Iran, North Korea, rather than China. The result would be cheaper and not noticeably less capable in those scenarios. Certainly, you'd be accepting some costs, right? You'd require more lead time for operations. There'd be some mobilization that would have to take place. And in major conflicts, you would definitely have to mobilize. Now, let me talk about that specifically, right? China is the elephant in the room, right? But I want to make a few points about China. First of all, the notion that China is sort of the replacement for the Soviet Union in our threat assessments is sort of problematic, just given the way our relationship is with them. We never trade with the Russians. We're intertwined fundamentally. I know everybody's going to say, oh, 1914, 1914, 1914. But look, the reality is that if you look at countries and their major trading partners, they rarely go to war with them. 1914 is not a single answer to the issue of economic interdependence. For the most part, economic interdependence, in fact, is a pretty good predictor of countries ultimately working together. All right? I'd say also the causes of conflict are likely to be limited. And here's one thing I like to point out. Look, one thing we talked about yesterday was we don't trust the Chinese don't trust us to provide secure sea lanes of communication, given their reliance upon trade and access to raw materials. We don't trust them to provide secure access to sea lanes of communication. But the fact that neither one of us trust each other to provide freedom of navigation doesn't mean that we don't both want freedom of navigation. okay? It's a coordination problem we have with China, not a conflict fundamentally. This is not like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a credible agenda that would have required it or led into a direction where it did want to cut trade, where it did want to bring down the international economic order. That's not the case with China. But here's the bigger piece from my view of China. Look, it doesn't really matter. If you get wrong, okay, and China becomes a real threat, how valuable would it have been to have built a small force of highly capable, a small, highly capable force? That's not going to win the war against China. A war against China isn't something that's going to be over in 3 weeks or 3 months. This is World War II, right? I mean, so the notion that you're going to have to defeat China with forces in being is absurd on its face. There's no point in planning a military that's going to last, that's going to be able to perform for 3 weeks against China when the conflict's going to last 3 years or more. So I'd say table China, put it aside. If the threat rises, we'll be able to deal with it, and anyway, we're going to have to fight them for a longer term. On the issue of healthcare, look, I don't have answers on healthcare. There's no amount of minor strategic adjustment that's going to get you out of the healthcare problem. Okay? The reality is that at current trend lines, our grandchildren will all be full-time either medical professionals or patients. 15% of GDP is now spent on healthcare. It's going to rise to 25% by the time our careers are over, okay? And by the time our grandchildren are in place, that's all literally we're going to be doing. Going from our medical office where we practice medicine to our doctors where we're treated, okay? That's absurd, and it's not sustainable. But look, if that's the kind of society we want to be in, where all we're doing is treating each other, that's the kind of society we're going to be in, and no grand strategic adjustment at the margins is going to affect that, right? This problem is too big to be fixed by tweaks in grand strategy or tweaks in the military budget. Either we fix it or we don't. Okay, let me make a positive argument now to sort of end my position. I do think, though, that even though a lot of the pressures aren't there, there are some opportunities for us to pursue a policy of restraint. I think it's a risky policy of restraint because it is one where our allies who we're talking about are the Indias, the Indonesias, Brazils, and I would argue even China, right, who I think has, on the whole, a similar stake in the international order than we do. I do think that a force which is also less capable but larger, operating in more places, is one which is more conducive to a transitioning of our allies or friends or potential partners into a more active role, simply because it allows for more interoperability. Okay? One of the major challenges we've had over the past 2 decades is that our allies can't keep up. They can't play with us. And if they can't play with us, they're not going to, we can't socialize them, take on a larger role. All right? Having a force which is less capable, which is more in line with their capabilities, is going to allow for more cooperation, more genuine partnership. I'd argue that's a good thing. Let me say sort of one last point about this here. You know, one example is this issue of how Britain sort of mentored the United States along to take a larger role in the world. That was a long-ass process. Okay? We like to think of ourselves in the United States as being such wonderful people, and we're exceptional. We've always been in favor of values and so on. But if you look at the way the United States behaved in the 19th century and early 20th century, we were really problematic. We threatened war on at least a half-dozen occasions over territorial disputes, ranging from the US-Canadian border on a number of occasions to going down into Venezuela. We threatened and bullied our neighbors in a way, in the Caribbean, right, in a way that the Chinese have not even begun to do in the South China Sea, right? We were free riding on British freedom of navigation. We were free riding on their open markets, even more so than the Chinese are free riding on our open markets. We behaved as badly, if not worse, than China is behaving right now. And the Brits said, but you know what? In the final analysis, these cats have similar long-term interests in us, different than, say, the Russians or the Germans. And if we have to choose about mentoring one of these rising powers into sort of a great power status, it's going to be the United States. They made the right choice. It's incumbent upon us now, I think, to make similar choices about what we can do with our allies. Let me just conclude by saying I think that a lot of our choices are really opening up some unexplored assumptions about risk. We need to talk about those more clearly. I think that by accepting relatively small amounts of additional military risk, right, which I acknowledge, means that if the balloon goes up, more young men and women will die, and it will take us longer to accomplish our goals, okay? That's not something I'm happy about, but it is a source of risk that needs to be balanced against the other sources of risk that are out there. I think that we have enough of a superiority that we can accept a little more of that risk. And finally, I think that there are compelling affirmative reasons for additional restraint that lead us to be able to husband or midwife, rather, a new generation of potential partners who I think can genuinely contribute to international security. I'll stop there. I'm sorry if I ran over time.
Only slightly. Nice job.